analog summed version. Now here's the all-digital version, which has never left the digital domain since it was first recorded, until the D to A converter you're now using in your DVD player or computer. If you're hearing a difference at all, it's probably subtle, and you may say there's a difference, but you can't actually say whether one is definitely better than the other. Rather than try to influence your opinion, we'd like you to try and discern what the comparison represents, whether you hear an overall difference or a difference that affects only one instrument, for example. The art of recording has a lot to do with learning how to listen, so we'd like you to make up your own minds on this issue. You'll probably want to listen to this in a more controlled environment and for a longer period. So we've posted the full-length result of this experiment on the website. These are, of course, uncompressed files and are formatted at 44.1 kHz at 24-bit resolution.
Here's top classical engineer Simon Rhodes from Abbey Road talking about a similar experiment he conducted.
I'm afraid that there was a certain transparency and depth of the virtual, which to my mind, for this orchestral recording, was just a hair better than having all the converters and all the summing amps, which for some people are an advantage, but for, I guess, for non-rock and roll recordings, nice orchestral, nice acoustic recordings, it really helped to maintain that pure nemesis which we're heading for. So I am a fan of working inside the box.
The purpose of both analog and digital mixers is to receive multiple inputs, process each of them individually, and create a recipe that balances them into a unified whole.
The cooking analogy is perfect. A mixing console takes multiple ingredients and combines them in what the engineer or producer feels is the correct amounts in order to serve up a tasty meal. Within each main audio ingredient is a set of its own preparation details, seasonings and spices, as it were. Although mixing desks look forbidding to the untrained eye, there's a lot of duplication. For example, a 24-input console typically has 24 channel strips, as we call them. A channel strip is a row of controls that all relate to one input channel. So we don't have to learn what every button and knob on the console does, just the controls on one strip for each of the input sources we're using. Each channel strip offers a quick snapshot of the current state of that channel, namely its input gain, pan, EQ and dynamic settings, and whether it's being sent to reverbs or delays, and finally at the end of the chain, where it's being routed to, typically tracks on a tape machine or a DAW, or to the main stereo bus for a final mix. All consoles and controllers perform the same basic functions, although there are operational differences and, in the case of controllers, major differences in terms of where the processing takes place. But to get an understanding of what these functions are, let's take them in a logical order, looking at a single channel source on an analog console.
The mic line switch.
This determines whether we are applying a mic signal or a high-level source, such as a keyboard, effects unit, or a tape track.
Phantom power.
This switch will usually be found on channels intended for microphone inputs. This is to activate the necessary 48-volt power supply to condenser mics. It's called phantom power because, rather cunningly, the power is actually carried down the same wires used for the mic's output signal. Some equipment is sensitive to having voltages fed into it, so it's best left switched off if it isn't needed.
Input gain.
This knob is a coarse control that determines how much amplification is needed for the console to raise the input source to a volume level that it can deal with. We call this the mic preamp stage, or mic pre for short. Microphones are low-level sources and need a fair amount of amplification or gain to get them up to the operating level we need. Other low-level sources include the output of a guitar or a bass pickup directly off the instrument itself. Of course, a mic on an instrument like a flute will need more amplification than a mic on a loud brass instrument. Mic pre's can also be external devices, so they can be fed directly into the console as a line input.
Phase switch.
This reverses the phase of the input, a very occasional requirement.
Dynamics controls.
These are a feature on many, but not all, modern consoles. For this, we'll see controls for limiting, compression, expansion, and noise gating.
Track output, busing, or routing switches.
These determine where the channel's sound source is going to end up, or where it will be output to. Typically, we'll go out to an individual track on a recording device, or to the main stereo bus in the case of a mixing session.
EQ controls.
Many of the knobs on a console will be dedicated to equalization, probably 3 controls, level, frequency, and Q, in a cluster for each of the EQ bands, bass, middle, and top. There are usually additional controls for high and low pass filters.
Auxiliary sends.
We usually want to send a signal to other places as well as to a record track or a stereo mix. Aux sends, or sometimes echo sends or Q sends, are a set of knobs which send out to reverbs, delays, and effects, for example, and possibly also to one or more separate mixes for performers' headphones. Headphone mixes are important because the performer will most likely want to hear a different mix balance to the engineer. In fact, every musician in a band might want a different balance. So some larger studios will allow for each musician in a band to control his own headphone mix on small individual Q mixes. This is a good thing because the engineer has more time to consider the overall picture without having to worry about getting everybody's mix exactly right. Sends are also likely to be used for setting up stems for a film dubbing session. Both the dynamics and the aux send sections will have another set of switches marked pre-post. These allow us to send a signal out to its designated destination either before it gets to the channel fader or after. Some people find this concept difficult to grasp, so I'll show you briefly how this works. I've got a vocal track of PJ's on this channel right here. Completely dry right now. I'm going to add some reverb post fade, and that means that as I increase the level of the vocal, the level of the reverb will go up with it. So if I go very quiet, the reverb is still in proportion to the level of the voice. Now if I go to pre-fade, by pressing the post button there, it doesn't matter where I have the fader, the reverb is always going to be constant. And there's only one point where it actually is in proportion when I reach a certain level on the fader. The most common way is to have it post-fade when you're mixing. You might want to send out of a fader pre-fade when you're sending to headphones, so that when you push the fader up and down in the control room, the musicians in the studio are not hearing that change. So that's when you would use a pre-fade send. It means that adjusting the main channel fader will not disturb the amount of signal going to the aux bus. That's important because you don't want, say, a monitor mix to change just because a particular sound has been increased or decreased in the main mix. On the other hand, we might want it to do just that. If we increase the fader level, we might want to increase the reverb.
Pan control.
The pan control, normally called a pan pot, determines the stereo positioning between far left, far right, dead center, or anywhere in between. Obviously this needs to be a stereo destination, say on 2 tracks armed for record, or the stereo bus. Pan is short for panorama.
PFL, or pre-fade listen.
The PFL switch allows you to instantly hear the sound of that particular channel on your main monitors or in your headphones, whether the channel fader is up or down. The signal path is arranged so that we can PFL a channel during a recording or mix without affecting the mix itself or the tracks being recorded. In other words, PFL activity will only be heard during the time it's activated and won't spoil the recording.
The solo button.
The solo button, on the other hand, is designed to cut all the other channels so that one or more channels can be isolated from the rest of the mix or the channels being sent to tracks. If I press the solo button during a recording, it will be reflected in the result at the outputs and will probably ruin the take. Some consoles allow the solo buttons to be configured safe. In other words, they will behave more like a PFL. Consoles can also offer a solo with effects facility so that we can isolate a single instrument but not remove any effects that have been applied to it.
The channel fader.
Finally, the channel fader controls the source's output level to its chosen destination. A second, smaller fader or knob will control the monitor level only. The functions of the big and small faders are interchangeable on some consoles. If the monitor controls are included on the channel strip, the console is then said to be an inline design. If the monitor controls are located elsewhere on the console, sometimes together on their own separate panel, then the design is called split. Faders are designed both for smooth changes in level and also to give you a quick visual indication of the current balance. I remember a session with a German classical engineer who would insist, "All my faders must be in a straight line." It's true to say that if all our monitor faders are equal and we are hearing a good mix, then we can pat ourselves on the back for recording everything at an appropriate level. On a multitrack recording, we'll adjust all our input faders to give us a comfortable recording level at the meter for each track, or at the stereo output meter when we're mixing. Sometimes we'll deliberately under-record certain instruments so that they don't drown everything else when played at normal level. A tambourine is a perfect example of something that doesn't need to be recorded at peak level. So let's now talk about metering in more detail.
Mechanical meters with a needle have for the most part been replaced these days by bar graph style meters, or graphic representations of them on a computer screen. There are two main types of meter, the VU meter and the PPM. Many consoles and DAWs will allow you to switch between the two.
On a PPM, the rise time, or the time it takes to show the level of a sound, is much faster than on a VU meter, which makes transients much easier to measure. Conversely, the fall time of a PPM, the time it takes the meter to indicate to a lower reading, is much slower. These rise and fall times come under the heading of meter ballistics. Books could be written about metering and ballistics, and there have been strong opinions expressed about what type of meter gives the best results. Suffice it to say that with VU meters, there can be a tendency to over-record, or in other words, record at too high a level on transient material like drums and percussive sounds. On the other hand, PPMs tend to display transient sounds as much louder than smoother sounds, like strings for example, and there is a tendency to under-record non-transient audio. If you're one of the few people left in the world recording to analog tape, the recording level and how you meter it has considerable importance. If you record to analog tape too quietly, tape hiss will be an issue. If you have to turn up a track, you'll, as a consequence, turn up the hiss. At the other end of the scale, tape will have a tendency to compress sounds recorded at too high a level. But that may be the very sound you, like many of your fellow producers, are looking for. Drums are sometimes recorded to analog tape specifically in order to get the slightly compressed result, whereas everything else might stay digital. The good news is that in the digital world we have a much greater available dynamic range, and provided your meters are reading not too low on the scale, and at the top of the scale nothing overloads or lights up the red clip light, you're probably recording at a good level. But if you choose to under-record, you're sacrificing some of the bit resolution. In other words, you might only be using 20 of the available 24 bits. On a mix, we'll want to record at a level that makes our recording sound at least as loud as the next man's. Or do we? If you're using a console, it's important that the meters are calibrated to match the levels of your tape machine or DAW. What's the use of reading the meters on the console if the recording device is treating everything as being 6 dB louder than the console meters are telling us? On VU meters, we normally accept that 0 VU is the maximum comfortable level that we'll allow a signal to reach. On analog equipment, we would be careful not to exceed this, although an occasional brief excursion into the red might be acceptable. On digital media, there's a level we call digital 0, or 0 dB FS, or full scale, where theoretically all the binary bits are ones rather than zeros. and it physically can't get any louder. If we do try to exceed digital 0, the results can be distinctly nasty. So we need to allow what we call headroom to allow for unexpected louder sounds, particularly transient peaks, so that they don't clip or distort. So we establish our operating level, 0 VU, as being a safe amount under digital 0. There are various standards from -12 to -20 dB, but I found a comfortable operating level is 14 dB below digital 0. So how do we go about calibrating our console and other equipment to our workstation? The easiest way is to have a digital test tone available to us, which is known to be at our precise chosen operating level. A good way to get this is from an audio test CD, such as this one, which appears to have somebody looking remarkably like me on its front cover. If I feed track 33 from the Soundcheck 2 CD, which is a 1 kHz tone at -14 dBFS or 14 dB below digital 0, into my DAW as a digital input, obviously my CD player has to have a digital output, I then adjust the calibration of all the inputs on my audio hardware, or in some cases I'll have to do it within the software program, so that the DAW sees that incoming level as 0 VU. Now I have a reference level to match my whole system to. If your equipment has a digital output, you could, at a pinch, use this as your reference level tone and save yourself the meager outlay of buying Soundcheck, but I think it's a real bargain. And there's lots of other good stuff on Soundcheck that you won't find on this DVD. A tone at digital 0 is very, very loud, and we won't torture you with it here, but you'll find it as large as life on Soundcheck. Now, when I send out a test tone from the console, in this case from its own onboard signal generator at 0 VU, it should be calibrated to be received by the recording device at -14 dB. This way, strong peaks which exceed 0 VU slightly will not overload, or give us what is called in the digital world an overlevel, where the red indicator lights up.
To cut down on the number of switches and buttons, many digital mixers divide the faders into banks and only allow us to view or modify channel parameters one at a time. We can switch the viewpoint from one channel to another, so effectively channel strips do still exist, but only in a virtual sense.
Sometimes a further duplication of controls or layers will allow other functions to be viewed and modified. For example, on this O2R96, the faders can switch from the channel's output level to the echo send outputs. Another layer might show us the headphone send levels. So why would we need to have all these channel strips when in the digital world all we need is one channel strip or even one fader? The answer is information. On this console I can see the entire snapshot of my recording configuration without touching anything. I can see by the position of the faders and whether switches are on or off and whether lights are on or off and the position of the knobs and so on, whether a particular function is actually active. It makes the engineer's job much easier when everything can be seen at once. On a compact console where I can only see one channel at a time, I'm going to have to do a lot of button presses just to get to the channel or layer that I'm interested in. Much harder, believe me, but that's one of the reasons that big consoles mean big bucks.
All mixers will have at least one set of outputs that carry the required monitor signal out to the main amplification system. This output will be dependent upon the setting of the monitor level or overall volume control.
So this is an important knob, and it's important to understand the signal path within a console and realize that, for example, pushing the channel faders or the main stereo bus fader will affect the monitoring as well as the recording. However, only the monitoring will be affected by changes in the monitor gain of a source or activating the PFL. Again, that's pre-fade listen. Other dedicated monitor outputs will feed secondary speaker systems and headphones, for example. Other faders, knobs and switches, aside from those that run along our channel strip, control functions relating to effects and monitoring different sources. This area of the mixer is often referred to as the master section. What differentiates a controller from either an analog or a digital console is its inherent flexibility, being able to link or assign certain knobs or controls to certain functions on your DAW. Assignability was a big word in the early days of digital consoles and controllers. Different consoles and controllers will offer more or less assignability, of course. Some controllers are also more aligned with a particular DAW, and some are truly agnostic or transparent. The Euphonics controller here allows us to switch between several DAW platforms at the touch of a button. Here I'm controlling Pro Tools, now I'm controlling Cubase, now Logic. By linking Euphonics MC mix units together, you can have up to 36 channels of control. There again, you can have knob and fader control at a far more pared down but still useful level on a unit such as the CC121 from Steinberg. This unit mirrors the precise layout of a Cubase mixer, and the large rotary knob will give you incremental control over any parameter you mouse over. Because I'm an old school engineer myself, I got very used to the idea that every mic or every tape track had its own fader. The other controls were a bonus, but lots of faders was a key factor. The level of a source is the most likely thing I'm going to want to change. It's just so easy on a console or controller that gives me a fader per channel. I can now grab a fader on a whim and make a level adjustment instead of having to search a screen or go through several button presses to find the right channel or layer that gives me the fader that I'm interested in at that moment. That's why the ergonomics of a controller are very important. Its operation has to be intuitive. A well-planned track layout will also help me instantly locate a track that I want to adjust without having to search for it. Many keyboards and other musical instruments contain their own digital interfaces and can be connected to a digital console or computer directly through a dedicated digital input or by USB or FireWire, for example, and could contain multiple individual tracks of information. So where does this leave the role of consoles and controllers in a modern recording rig? The functionality and the real estate price per square foot is a big issue, but in the home studio world, compactness is an absolute must. A big surface means instant accessibility. A small, compact surface can offer just as much flexibility, but at the expense of the time taken to find the right button or switch hiding within a complicated menu. I've said many times that recording is a balancing act, and with consoles and controllers, the equation might be, as much as anything else, your ability to balance your bank account as well as balance your mix.
Perhaps the best reason why hands-on equipment is so valuable to the recording process is that its physicality and immediacy helps create the magic, as Patrick Leonard describes working with one of his favorite engineers, Bill Bottrell.
When we started the Elton John record, the first mix he did the first day, and he just, does his thing. At one point I said something about brightening the cymbals, and he goes, "Oh yeah, okay," and he pushes in an equalizer and on this Neve console, and then the mix is finished and it's stunning. It sounds amazing. And then the legend goes that we left and all the engineers in the building wanted to come in and see the console. Like, what had Bill done? Because this guy's really revered. There was nothing in the patch bay. There was no compressors. There was no equalizers. There was no effects. There was no EQs pushed in except one button. And there was a couple pan pots turned in faders. So he uses the console to compress. He uses the ratios between things to equalize. Literally. No, nothing. And it sounds like, you listen to this thing, it just sounds like audiophile stellar.
Here's how Nico Bolas remembers one of his earliest sessions with legendary engineer Glyn Johns.
I want to go to lunch. And I says, "Oh, you got to mix it because I want to learn how to sound like Glyn Johns." And he looked at me like I was out of my mind. And he sat down at the console and he just went, and it sounded like Glyn. And he got up and he said, "Now mix it." And I had no idea what he did. All he did was turn up the shit that he thinks is his favorite stuff. And he filled up the speakers the way he hears music, which is not what he wanted. He wanted to see how I hear music.